There we go.
Aha.
How's it going?
Yeah, it's going great. I'm so thankful that you could spend time out of your apparently very busy day. Uh,
Yeah, I hadn't realized that I had agreed to do Hans's. Is it Hans or Haas? Hans's panel like a week ago or something.
okay.
And then I was like, wait, I told Prime that I'd do the free speech topic. So yes, busy day. The bar review got a little bit on the back burner today, but hopefully we'll pick it up tomorrow.
Dude, you're gonna crush it. Like I know it. I know it. I know it.
Hopefully.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And free speech is on the bar, so it'll be a nice review.
All right, fantastic. So yeah, let's jump into it. So I saw a case while I was looking for topics, right? And I'll put the link in chat so everyone else can take a look at it.
Is Mahoney
Mahoney.
the name of the case?
No. I mean, like
Oh,
the article that I showed you.
I'll go.
Yeah. So I'll put it in Twitch chat so you guys can all see. So within Virginia, I believe it is Virginia, there is a school teacher, elementary school teacher, who spoke up during a meeting, like a school meeting, like so not during class, but like during some sort of school board meeting. There was going to be a proposed change that will require teachers to use the pronouns, preferred pronouns of their children, right? So if they've changed their gender identity, then use those pronouns. So something that hadn't even gone into effect. So he spoke up and he said that he wasn't going to do it. And he said that because of his religion, it would be wrong. It'd be a sin, right? It would be lying to affirm someone's gender identity through pronouns. He was then suspended, and he it went through the courts, and then a judge has like revoked that suspension, so he's back at it, and uh, his lawyers, of course, are saying it's a violation of his free speech. So I wanted to discuss that, like what are the limits in school of free speech, right? And again, this didn't happen in the classroom, but it's certainly related to school. What are the limits to free speech, and what do we want out of it, right? When it comes to situations like this, especially when we're dealing with children, what exactly do we want? Because I think the answers may not be so obvious as to, especially to us leftists, right? Who are like, "Fuck this guy, fire him." Maybe that wouldn't be the best outcome for something like this. So I want to discuss it with my very good friend Pisco, a legal beagle, soon, very soon to become an eagle. So, Pisco, did you manage to learn a little bit about this?
Yeah, so I looked at the article real quick
Mm,
and have some thoughts.
mm,
So first off, another disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer yet. I know that we already did that, but this is not me intended to give the definitive legal whatever about
mm.
anything. Um, I did take a free speech class, so I'm sure I'm regurgitating a lot of what I learned from that class. And so this is kind of my perspective on this issue. One is typically the First Amendment applies as to government action, number one. There's a requirement that there be a nexus with some kind of state action. When I say state, I mean government. Um, there are some exceptions to that, as people like Lecture Fan are quick to point out. There's the Marsh case where um, so-called company towns have been required to respect free speech, even though they're privately generated, privately chartered towns, just because they're so close to what towns and government functions are. But that's kind of a particular sui generis. That means like specific um, doctrine applied to company towns that hasn't really been expanded a lot from there. So a nexus to some government or state action for the First Amendment to apply. And so when I would first look at this case, I would say, well, what has the government done here? There's no prohibition for a company. Let's say that you insult a customer or are not sex positive or not gender positive or whatever
Mhm.
the company wants its forward facing representatives to be like, they could fire you. And of course, wouldn't it be a First Amendment issue there? And so first, what you got here is a public employer because it's a county school. a school district. And that school is not a private school. And just so you know, even though the First Amendment says Congress shall pass no law respecting an establishment of religion or abridging the freedom of speech, it's also been interpreted to apply to states as well. And from the states, you know, the towns get their sovereign, they get that from the states, the towns, and anything that the town like controls and dominates, like schools, that would also go up to apply the same rules. That's why like schools can't force you, public schools, to pray, but private schools can, right? Private schools can require you to pray. And so here we have a government action basically suspending you, giving you some consequence. The teacher's First Amendment rights, punishing her, I think, or the teacher, whoever they are, him, sorry, for saying something. And so that is probably going to invoke the First Amendment a little bit, which is what is the basis for firing this person? Because we would feel uncomfortable with government institutions just firing everyone who suppose that a government institution that employed you fired you because you were a Republican or fired you because you were a Democrat. That would seem very weird, I think, to that the government is allowed to do that. Although in many cases, right, in the case of the president nominating someone to be attorney general, they're looking for a Republican. So I'm not entirely sure what the case law is on hirings and firings, but I imagine that there's some basis under which public employers are not allowed to fire you because of an opinion. And then the question would be, I think, does the government have a good enough reason to fire you on the basis of this particular speech?
So I think, the usual talk about speech, like you've discussed this before on my stream, talking about how speech is limited when it comes to schools, right? But again, this wasn't within like a classroom, right? I didn't say this to children, right? Mm-hmm. And he was talking about a regulation that hadn't even been enacted, right? Like, this is my opinion on the proposal. So like, it's hard to say that this was at all like destructive, right?
Yeah. So what I was referencing typically, I think the case law is Tinker. That's the name of the
Pickering analysis. Someone put that in chat.
Tinker is the name of the case. Tinker. There's another case I think called Hazelwood, or there are these cases that apply typically to like children's free speech rights. And so I think the rule is if it's substantially limits or abridges the pedagogical or whatever basically hampers the ability of schools to teach their children, you're allowed to infringe on the students' free speech rights there. And so that would be even if it's like a content-based thing, like if I say the F word in general public, no one's gonna arrest me, barring some like weird thing, right? But if I were a child saying it in school, in the classroom, I could get in trouble I could even get expelled if I said, "Go F yourself, Mrs. Smith." Like, that would be a basis under which, I could be fired. Oh, sorry, not fired, expelled.
You'd be a legend though, but go ahead.
Yeah. but that doctrine, right, that applies typically to the children's First Amendment rights. And as you rightfully said, the teacher wasn't in school at the time. There's a case right now, I think it just went up for oral argument some weeks ago or some months ago, called Mahoney. That's why I said Mahoney, I think, where they're stretching what does it mean to be in school? Because the girl in that class was cut from was suspended from the volleyball or cheerleading or some team for a year based on like a Snapchat that she sent while she was in some shop or somewhere off campus. And so they're saying, like, can we punish a child, infringe a public school, punish someone for something a child said, even though they're enrolled in the school, but off of school property? And the argument is, well, either the phone, they're going to receive it in school, so it's the same thing. Or the argument is like, well, that just encompasses their whole life because their friends are all from school. They're always talking about school stuff that dominates their lives. And so if you if you apply this doctrine endlessly, then kids have no free speech rights. I'm more on that side of the camp. I think it's ridiculous that you're going to apply it to, kids have a right to vent, and if it causes problems in school, address it in school, but don't punish them based on that speech. That's like the government as educator doctrine of speech. It's kind of not really at issue here because, as you said, this was not an interaction with a child. This is not as part of a pedagogical experience. It was off campus. And so really what this is getting into is this teacher allowed to give their opinion on pronouns and say that I'm not going to abide by this policy if it's passed or this law? I think it's a harder case. I certainly think a teacher giving and making statements about what their intentions are for the future could be a basis to fire. Imagine that you said, yeah, I'm going to bully all my children and I'm going to do it relentlessly next year. Starting next year, I'm going to just start bullying all these kids. And I don't care if there's a policy that tells me I can't do it. Would anyone say like the school doesn't have a right to get rid of you? Even the fact that you would say that statement indicates that you are not fit to be a teacher. The fact that you would go out and say, this is not equivalent to the statement that was said necessarily, although we'll talk a little bit about the comparison there. But if you were to give that statement, I think that would be a valid reason to fire someone, because it puts into question their ability to actually teach. And so I think if we can all agree on that, well, do we agree on that, Prime? That if someone said, my intention is to bully children this coming year, that firing them wouldn't raise a First Amendment issue or would surpass whatever First Amendment issue was presented?
I think if they're claiming that they're a danger to children, then I think yes, will surpass any First Amendment protections.
Yeah. And so I think that, okay, so I guess the Merles, who is a lawyer and I'm not, is saying that there's a Pickering threshold analysis, which I'm not considering. I'm sure I'm missing some part of the analysis here. But I would think that this issue, frankly, is a lot closer to that case. You have it is very important for children to feel safe in school and for children to be protected in school and to have a learning environment which is good. Okay? And I think that legislators and school administration officials should be in charge of making that a priority. And if you have a teacher, if the legislators and the administrators have come to a decision that it's best to have whatever positive, I don't know, what's the policy again? Using
pronouns.
Using by gender, the correct pronoun, and that is in their mind, and they've determined that is in the best interest of the child and their education. I don't think that a teacher who is saying that they're going to disagree with that policy and determination, it's not up to them. It's a policy that has been entrusted to our legislators and who have entrusted it to administrators. And I think that you saying that you're going to disagree with that policy it's totally fine for termination there. If you don't like to get with the program. Now, you could come back at me. There's another angle here, which is this a religious, like a religious freedom thing? I think that's dead in the water. Just because there are a lot of problematic religious beliefs that if I were to try to impose on children in the capacity as educator, suppose that I said, well, it's my religious belief that women shouldn't learn about finances. I just think that that's just my religious dogma tells me that is not okay. Of course, it would be okay to punish the person who made that, who decided for themselves in a unilateral fashion that that's the goal of the institution. The educators themselves, the teachers themselves, don't get to decide what the community's teaching priorities are. There are some threshold issues, basic issues like constitutional issues. I don't think a local community should be allowed, if they think that the best thing for their students is to have them pray. I don't think that the community gets to say, because there are some things which do cross constitutional grounds in my mind, which would oversee, I think, the local expertise argument that I laid out.
Let's go back to the bullying aspect, because I think that's a really interesting comparison, right? So, is not using gender affirming pronouns bullying? I think a lot of people in my chat would say that it is. And especially this coming not just from a student, right, but from a teacher, a place of authority, saying that, like, no, you are not this thing, and I am actively going to, like, even if you're asking me nicely, I'm going to say this, and then this will in turn encourage students not to use those pronouns as well, right, and to maybe harass you later on. So I can definitely see that how that would be included as bullying, but uh, so like, would that be would that only count if it's included within some like school policy though? You know?
Yeah, I think that the argument can't be that, like, it can't, it has to have a limiting principle. I agree. I think you're uncomfortable with the notion that we could characterize any statement as bullying, and thereby free it from constitutional scrutiny by comparisons to stuff. That's a good point to raise. I can let you know that I do not know the specific public employment. The Merles is sending me stuff like right now about what the rule is with public employment. I thought that we were going to be talking about Tinker and this other case, but there's some threshold steps to determine whether or not it raises First Amendment concerns, and I think that it would have to reach that threshold. If you give me a minute to read over this, then maybe I could elucidate that. Just give me 1 second.
Yeah, mute me and then I'll entertain the audience. Okay. So yeah, I think this is a fascinating case because I think this is a bit of an edge case, like we're saying. So it doesn't involve students, but there's so many places we can take this, and I'm gonna drag us there. Like, so what happens if a parent, right? So like, let's say, because Pisco was talking about like, educators decide that this is something that is appropriate for students, right? That is will advance them, right? Will make their school life better using these pronouns, right? Then that's something that the community has decided, that the educators have decided, and that should be a regulation to be followed. But what if you're in a different community that says the opposite? We have plenty of those communities, right? We have plenty of those communities who don't care, who will never pass a school policy like this. It's just way out there for them. And a parent sues, right? Should they have the ability to sorry, what is Gento? I always hear it. Sorry, I'm getting highly distracted by the chat here.
No worries. I read it up on it, so I can elucidate a little bit for you, Prime.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so from what I just read, from what the Merle, and credit to the Merles, he sent me this in like 2 seconds, and I think I kind of remember one of these cases from my legal education. Don't let this be an indictment on my institution, though I haven't said my institution out loud. So it's a 2-part test. I think it's called the Pickering test, and essentially you ask, first of all, is this employer speaking of a matter of public concern? And so that kind of makes sense. If I am saying, gosh, I hate my boss. My boss is such a jerk. They all they do is they don't know how to do their job. They're horrible in the way they treat me. That wouldn't be a matter of public concern, because you would expect, right? If you hate your boss and you're not working with your boss and you have a lot of bad interactions with your boss at like the DMV, all those communications outside of the context of employment would be protected by the First Amendment, but unless it rose to like harassment or something. But because of the nature of employment, we're not going to give scrutiny over those statements because they're not areas of public concern. However, if you do make a statement about, say, the Iraq War, right? I come out and say, I'm in favor of us going to war in Iraq or us getting out of Iraq. That would be a matter potentially of public concern if there was some public debate. And there, the court will be in the business of balancing whether or not there's sufficient interest in maintaining decorum and not disrupting stuff. So let's say that you came out and said Palestine doesn't deserve any help. Palestine doesn't even deserve any democratic consideration whatsoever. Suppose that you were to say something like that, and your school was just absolutely full of people who supported Palestine's autonomous rights, and every day you were having these interactions where people were picketing, people weren't going to school, and all these disruptions, and the school couldn't maintain its whatever, right? So in that case, you have an issue of public concern, namely the role of Palestine, whether or not it should have what rights it should have. But the disruption to the school is extremely, extremely high. And so maybe there the court would say, well, although we know it's an issue of public concern, we're going to weigh the interest of the school heavily here because there's a lot of evidence to show that there was this disruption. Give it a different case. Let's say that you speak out against the Democratic governor, and all of the administrators are Democrats, but the students don't really care. Like whatever. You're a Republican, and they're like, we're going to fire you because we had a call with the governor, and the governor told us, hey, this teacher talked crap about me. There, the school, it's an issue of public concern, right? It's the governor, how they're doing. And the interest in disruption isn't really high there because the students don't really care and nothing's happening as a result. There, the court's going to balance and say, okay, the free speech rights dominate. And in that case, you have to reinstate them. And so that's the kind of way to look at it. The first, is this an issue of public concern? And then even if it is, what are the balancing of interests between the speech and the school's interest in maintaining decorum?
Okay. So going for that DMV thing just for a second, right? So
yeah.
you'd be a public employee, right?
Yep.
And even if you had said something like, well, I think the Iraq war shouldn't happen, right? Because the disruption that could happen from a DMV employee saying that rather than someone in the State Department saying that, right? Those would be two different things, right? And so like, even though like I'm guessing those would be judged slightly differently because
I think that would make a difference. Also keep in mind a lot of this is as applied to like non-political appointees. There's a lot of deference paid to like in terms of like federal executive stuff, a lot of deference paid to the executive branch when it comes to like foreign relations stuff. So I'm sure that there's other rules also to apply in the context of political appointees and other rules to apply in context of state stuff and foreign relations and immigration. All that stuff I think would have a tendency to probably have different rules or different concerns to balance. But it's a good way to apply. I mean, imagine that you have a DMV person who is speaking out in their private time about how awful Joe Biden is, or how, right? Is that going to disrupt the workplace? Probably not. Right? It's not going to disrupt the workplace. Am I even going to know the DMV person is a Trump supporter? Like, who cares? It's not like we're having a lot of communications about it. Now, if every time I had an interaction with a person in the DMV, I was like, Biden's horrible. He's just a awful person. And like people were having long lines were happening because I couldn't shut up about Biden. Maybe that's a different case. I think the view is also on the workplace itself. The DMV, the State Department, the school, is it disrupting that place, not whether it's disrupting society as a whole. And so maybe that could be a way to say like, okay, if we start firing people who are Democrats in the State Department, maybe that's because our version of I don't know if there's a different rule to apply in the State Department, but maybe it's because like it would be disruptive to have people who disagree with us on basic policy to be in the State Department kind of deal. I would love to apply this to the case that we have before us. So one is are the usage of pronouns an area of public concern? Maybe, right? Is my particular application of this policy to my students an area of public concern? I don't know. There's like a lot of there's ways you can spin this in that it's like obviously an area of public concern. Everyone's talking about pronouns. It's a hot button issue, especially among left circles. But there's also a way you could see a different level of generality and say, well, no, he's advocating for his particular relationship with his particular students. And he's telling us how he's going to interact with his students. He's not giving opinions about, this issue of public concern in the first place. So that threshold question, I'm maybe not so sure based on my limited knowledge that the Merles is 100% correct, that it's obvious that it doesn't meet the public concern threshold. And so I'm curious, what do you think? Do you think that the use of pronouns is an area of public concern?
Well, there's a massive interest. There is a there's ongoing political campaigns to either advance it and make this a requirement, right? That's why they're even talking about this in the first place, right? This doesn't happen if there isn't a political movement behind pushing for gender affirming pronouns, gender affirming speech. In all areas of life, right? And then there's the backlash, right? A entrenched backlash against it, and to the point where laws are being signed. So, of course, it has to be an area of public concern. But whether it's disruptive, I mean, I guess what counts as disruptive here? Because to the child, right? So if I am a child who has changed their pronouns and it's not being affirmed, right, then I have someone, and remember, these are elementary school kids we're talking about, and I have a teacher who is actively going against that, then it's highly disruptive for me. For the rest of the class, maybe not so much. It's maybe something to talk about, something to make fun of me about, but it's not very disruptive for me. So yeah, it's like the school's functions will continue unless if there are massive protests, right? Then that would be it. But for so many kids, that won't happen. That would never happen. So yeah,
the misgendering of one teacher causing a movement or a greater conversation that disrupts school activity. Maybe you're right. Or although aren't schools allowed to think about risks and say, well, maybe it's not likely, but maybe we think it's 10% likely. And if it is 10%, we're in a whole lot of trouble. And all of us are going to have to dedicate so many hours to dealing with this problem, and school's going to be disrupted. Yeah, okay, maybe it's not particularly likely to happen, but suppose that it's the one story that gets picked up by John Oliver and then everyone knows about it. Are we going to take that risk? It's a good question. I don't know. I would give a lot of latitude with respect to this issue because he is speaking about his future intentions. He's saying, I love all my students, but I will never lie to them, regardless of the consequences. I will never. I am a teacher, but I serve God first. I will not affirm that a biological boy can be a girl and vice versa because it's against my religion. It's lying to my child. It's abuse to a child, and it's sinning against our God. That to me is a statement about my future intentions. It's saying that I'm not going to listen to the school. What could be more disruptive than that? I will, in my capacity as teacher, I will not follow school policy in dealing with the students. That to me is disruptive. If he were to say out in public, I don't agree with using preferred pronouns, but then would use them in class, I would say the school probably shouldn't get rid of him because if he's complying, I'm totally fine with him expressing his views on pronouns outside of school, but he is stating his future intentions in non-compliance with a policy that's been determined to be in the best interest of the child. I think that and maybe it reaches a threshold of public concern, but I think it would certainly be disruptive.
So I'm not sure. Did you hear what I stated before about like the parent?
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I missed that part.
No, it's fine. It's fine. While you were reading, it was that what if the community in the school did not reach this conclusion? They didn't care about gender affirming pronouns. You did have a teacher who, the same teacher, who refused to use them, even though the child and their parent asked them to, right? And then the parent sues the school, saying that this is a form of bullying. Well, that makes sense, right? Because I mean, your focus, when you said before, is that it will be up to the educators to decide. Well, educators don't seem to care, right? That this is not a harm, and so, but like, how?
It's a hard case.
Yeah.
So one is it raises the issue of, so first of all, this is a private interaction between the student and the teacher, and so this would tend to get out of a lot of the domains, whatever we're talking about here, if it's with respect to the teacher's actions.
Is it private? Is it private interaction? I mean, this is this speech is happening in class. Does that count as a private interaction?
Less private. It's less private than, sorry, it's more private than whatever this guy who stood up and said this thing is. So maybe you're right. Maybe it's not. Is it an area of public concern how I speak to your particular child? That's what I mean with the public-private kind of thing. That seems to be less about the area of public concern. It's more about how I'm going to relate to your particular child. And so that's number one. Number two is on the issue of who's suing who. This would be the child suing the teacher in the school for like some kind of tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress, or some kind of, that would be like the bullying, or let's say that there's some cause of action there. There you would be entangling with a lot of doctrines of like sovereign immunity. And, you know, are you allowed to sue the teacher in this case? There are, believe it or not, issues of immunity that apply to a lot of these state actors. I'm not sure in the school context if they get a qualified immunity of sorts. I'm not sure about that. But I think that's a barrier that you have to be able to. I think maybe you can sue towns and schools easier than you can sue states. I'm not sure about that. But and oftentimes states have statutes that says you're allowed to sue us if this. And then you know, they probably have insurance anyway, so so maybe that's why you're suing to get some money from the insurance company. But it's an interesting case. Does it raise First Amendment concern? Maybe it also raises First Amendment concerns. You know, does a teacher have a right to call your child names? It's starting to sound more like harassment and less like First Amendment speech, right?
But are they calling your child names, right? So this teacher, right? I didn't see it. I thought I saw it in the article, but I guess I didn't. I read it over again. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that, well, even though I won't use these pronouns, right? I'll just use their name, right?
Oh, I missed that part.
I'm not sure if it was in the article, but like let's say that it was. Let's say that it was. Yeah.
That's, I think, a harder case to make out for the kid. Because I think we can all agree if it were misgendering someone, that would rise, I think, more like harassment. So suppose that I was like, suppose it's gender pronouns out of it, and I just call someone who is a boy, you're a girl, 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 in this targeted way, or in a way that disrupts their education. I think that it would quite clearly, that's like a targeted harassment. I think if someone has expressed their, you know, unwillingness to engage on that level, or to debate, or to have you bring it up every time. Suppose that instead of boy or girl gender divide, I'm just saying, hey ugly, hey fatty, right? That no one would have any doubt that would be covered like harassment. That would be harassment. And so I don't for misgendering, I would apply it just as I would apply for like fat or ugly, right? It's a targeted comment with the intention or the knowledge at least that it's harming someone when they've asked you to stop. I think that that would raise things about like harassment for me. Now, if you're saying that they are going to find a gender neutral way to address you just by going by your name, I think I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that being a compromise. Because I think unless they've expressed to you that they're uncomfortable being called by their name, you're not doing anything other than treating them differently in terms of your usage of pronouns. But you are making an accommodation for them in a way that I think maybe you fire them if it's really disruptive. But if I were the child, would you feel? I'm trying to think now. Would I feel called out and particularized and hurt if a teacher, rather than use the pronoun that I've told them I prefer, sort of stubbornly just went by my name? I don't know. I can't put myself in those shoes.
Yeah.
Maybe someone in the chat or someone else can tell me how that could be very impactful and hurtful, that they're being constantly use their names. But I think it's a harder case.
Much harder case.
Yeah.
But now that you said it, the obvious thing to do when analyzing this, right? You skimmed on this just now, but the obvious thing to do is to flip things around. A cis person, right?
Yeah.
They are a boy, and you're calling them a girl, right? Like, how is that not bullying, right? Like, that is a thing that causes people emotional distress. I am not a girl, right? You keep calling me that. That's what little bullies on the schoolyard do, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I have no problem construing misgendering as, does it rise to a level of a crime? No, I don't think it would ever rise to like a level of a crime or anything like that. But is it a cause for some private right of action in terms of like civil damages? If you can show that I was damaged and harassed, I think that's still probably a high bar to get there. But if with regards to punitive action from the school, I'm much more comfortable with the school firing someone because they refuse to adhere to whatever decency standard the school has promulgated.
Yeah.
And even if they haven't, right? Even as you say, even if they haven't, if the child has made clear what their preference is, then maybe that's more okay. Although here I'm about to I'm concerned that someone will bring up like, well, what if a child asks for you to call them something totally ridiculous and they claim that it's who they are? I think this gets us into uncomfortable areas involving like trans, other kinds of
otherkin type
identities,
stuff. Yeah,
right? And that to me is an somewhat uncharted area where I don't know where my opinion or what the limiting principle is there. I think there has to be a limiting principle, but I'm not sure what that is, and I'm not comfortable engaging on those hypotheticals. Or I'm less comfortable engaging on those hypotheticals without some proof that someone actually is adhering to those identities and is right.
I mean, I think people are, but I'm not exactly sure if they're forcing the world to acknowledge them, right? So you can see people on TikTok and you see people on social media platforms saying that they
squirrel stuff.
Yeah, like saying that they are like a star or they're whatever, right? They're an animal or whatever they are, right? So. But okay, so I'm just like thinking about this. That I think it's really fascinating. I never considered that. All right. So what if someone asks you to call them a slur? Like,
yeah, there has to be.
Yeah.
There now you have another balancing issue, which is the other children. You have to consider them as well. If society has reached a point where the slurs don't have their toxicity anymore, or no one is going to chortle anytime someone calls you a squirrel or something, then I think that there's less of a case that this is a real disruption. So then maybe it's okay calling them a slur or calling them by like an animal name or something. But that it seems very hard to envision that being a society where is going to happen soon. And so I would always think that calling someone by a slur, even if they want to, would raise issues of someone overhearing it, right? Suppose that other children, if you call them in public, but then you're like, okay, you don't have to say it in public, but how about private interactions with my child and you? Then you can say a slur. Well, no, that doesn't quite solve it, because then if a news station picks up that you're calling someone a slur, that's going to disrupt everything as well. So even in the private context, unless like society as a large has said that using slurs is okay, it seems hard for me to envision that it would be tolerable for a school, or you could force a school to call your child a slur. So there are ways, I think, to maneuver yourself such that you could discount the problematic requests.
So,
but philosophically, maybe hard to distinguish.
So I actually have I've talked about this on stream before. In college, met a individual. Everyone was calling him KJ, right? KJ. It stood for King Jew, right? And I talked to this individual. It was like, is this okay, right? I'm never going to slur any individual, right? And I'm not going to be anti-Semitic. But he was Jewish, and he was like, no, it's fine, it's okay, you can call me, it's no problem. I'm imagining an administrator or anyone within that school calling him that, KJ, right? It's one thing they don't know what it stands for.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
But so suppose that the teacher knew, should the knowledge of what it stands for matter at all to the analysis of whether or not it's acceptable? And it's a good hypothetical. Well, one is, I think the use of Jew as a word, as a label, I think maybe has less venom than some of the other slurs. Although using the word Jew in a particular way does, I think, imply some anti-Semitic connotation. So if you say something like, he's just a Jew, or he's a Jew, or something, and you use it in that way, I think people can interpret anti-Semitic sort of feelings from that. So yeah, I think that conceivably is an issue. I think we'd all have an issue with our teacher calling one of the students King Jew, if suppose that it wasn't the acronym, and it was just, hey, yeah, you, King Jew. Like, I think that all of us would have some reaction to that.
Yeah.
And that this is probably not okay. And so does the acronym make it acceptable? I think, what is the philosophical difference between being okay with KJ as opposed to being okay with King Jew? The only thing that I can hang my hat on is how other people are going to interpret it. And how, KJ is not an abnormal name. I've heard people have been called KJ.
Yeah.
I know someone named who their name isn't KJ, but sometimes they go by KJ. And it's common enough, I think, that random people aren't going to get the willies. But should that matter if everyone knows what they're referring to? That's a hard case. I'm not sure.
Yeah. What about KN, right? King N-word. Like, but you know what that stood for, and everyone's calling him KN. All right, well, KN.
I think that hypothetical forces me to say that it matters whether or not the administrator knows, because if we knew that that's what it stood for, people would have different reactions than if it was just someone named Kim Nancy and people call her, KN or something, right? And so I think that hypothetical this is why hypotheticals, I think, are very useful, because I think it's made me realize that intention does matter, and what the word actually stands for matters. It matters because if people find out about it, if students find out about it, it could be disruptive. It could be disruptive, and it could, maybe the administrators fear that the kids would start using the actual phrase, or would use it as an excuse to use the actual phrase in a way that they thought it was unacceptable. Maybe they thought the parents would find out, and, oh my God, they're calling him this because it stands for that. Oh, we're not going to send our kids there anymore. So I can see more reasons for disruption, even though it's the same acronym, if it stands for something that's disagreeable.
So there was
a good hypothetical.
Yeah, thank you. Relating it back to what actually happened in college. And I've told this before. So we, including myself, I called him KJ. He wanted me to call him. I swear to you, he wanted me to call him KJ. So I did. Yeah. So I called him KJ. But at some point, right, a new student came on before, right? So a dorm room. We were all in a dorm room, dorm floor, where this happened, these interactions happened. Now, we had some, a lot of white men there who took this liberally, right? Like they had no problem pushing the limits as to what you could and couldn't say, right?
Yep.
And they called my friend King Jew, and they also said some things that could definitely be portrayed, thought of as anti-Semitic, right? But the guy was fine with it, right? KJ was okay with all of this. There was another student who came on, Jewish, heard all this, and then immediately
didn't
left.
Understand. Yeah.
Immediately left. And when we found out, right, we found out this all happened behind the scenes, right? These guys were highly aggrieved. How could you think that we were anti-Semitic? We're just calling him King Jew all the time, right? Like,
because he asked for it, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's such a good point, because what I missed from my analysis was what you said is that they want to be called this. Mm-hmm. And I think the answer is you should be careful. And teachers, suppose that I said, oh, I really want to be called a slur. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I can't do that. Now you might say, well, you just told me that I have to call them whatever pronoun they want at all times. Mm-hmm. I think it really matters. It's kind of circular in a way. Mm-hmm. What society thinks about the word determines whether or not it's okay to call the child that word. And the fact that the educator in this case was having a conversation about whether or not that word was even acceptable, in this case pronouns, shouldn't they be allowed to have that discussion in the first place? I don't know. It's a very tough issue, but I think it really does matter whether or not society views as acceptable the usage of that word. And I think at least in America, there has been a recognition by a lot of people, I don't know if a majority, I don't know the polling on this, that using pronouns, the correct pronouns for transgender people is okay. I don't know what the polling is. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And should it just be a majority rules thing? I don't know. Should it just be majority rules? Should it be just polling? I'm not sure. A lot of this feels a little bit arbitrary. I'm not going to lie to you. These are very good hypotheticals that are getting at the bottom of our rationale, and I'm feeling uncomfortable.
Yes, I get you. Which is also more uncomfortable. And these are questions I'm not asking you to answer, right?
Yes, no. I don't mean uncomfortable in a way that like I don't want to be here anymore. I mean the ideas are making me question myself.
Yeah. So is not using pronouns, is that slurring, right? It's go ahead.
Here's a thing that I would say on that. I don't really see a big action-inaction distinction that people oftentimes will draw. I know it's relevant insofar as a lot of legal doctrines, whether or not you fail to save someone versus whether or not you murdered someone. But in the case of, it's very relevant distinction in American jurisprudence. But I think if you can prove that like someone is not calling you a pronoun on purpose, I think that's a different case than someone messing up or just trying to be neutral. And so even though I think that the inaction or the spoken non-gendering versus, but here's another wrinkle to that, because I think being neutral intentionally is different than misgendering. Because if you're being neutral with the knowledge that they have a gender pronoun preference, you are not misgendering someone. You're still not doing that. And so at the very least, you're not causing that more harm. The only harm you would be causing is anybody who feels harmed by the prevalence by which you are referring to them by their given name as opposed to a pronoun. And I don't know how many people feel upset.
Yeah.
There might be some people,
Yeah.
but I don't know how many people feel upset because the person they're talking to is overusing their given name as opposed to referring to them with a pronoun.
Yeah. It's too tough of a case.
It's a tough issue.
Yeah.
Maybe I just want to say maybe it does exist. I mean,
Yeah.
I can think of, suppose that you are a student in the classroom and the teacher willy-nilly refers to cisgender people by the proper pronoun and all the time is using pronouns, but then very consciously is using your, like, let's say long name every time they refer to you, or having to stop their sentences to like put in your name as opposed to using a pronoun. Maybe I could envision a scenario where that makes someone very uncomfortable. So I can see it, but speech is is a very thorny thing, and I think it's probably better than misgendering someone, to be completely neutral about it. And maybe it's a good idea for there to just be a universal pronoun that we just use. And maybe that would be like they.
Okay. Yeah.
But then there are some people who don't want to be referred to as they. They want to be referred to by she or he.
Yeah.
These are tough issues, and I don't know if there are clear answers.
Yeah.
It depends on how people feel. Language, for me, there's no objective truth to like language in my mind. Language is malleable. It's a set of things that change and shift, and whether or not something is appropriate depends on society's reaction to it. And it's more than just the speaker, and these words don't exist in some transcendental realm where there can be truth found there. The speaker and the listener are both important, and so I would like to hear more from people who actually say, non-gendering someone maybe not as bad as misgendering, but it's still a problem.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear that.
And I was thinking about like whether it becomes a slur, because just like what you just said is exactly right. It depends on the speaker. It depends on who's the receiver, right? The listener. So you can imagine that within, like, you could just make this up, like within the trans community, right? Like I've heard this, like they might use a slur, right, the T slur to each other, right? Like that's fine. Well, I mean, you see that in the Black community, right, using the N-word, right? And in that situation, like, no offense, well, it depends, but mostly no offense is taken on that, right? So we can see that you can use the same words, just different context and different speakers, and it changes. So, like,
I'm okay with that, by the way. I'm okay with the use. Oftentimes, I think there are valid reasons to use words. Valid reasons to educate, for instance. I don't agree that these words should be like "he who shall not be named," Voldemort status. Another, I think, genuine use is an art, right? Sometimes you need to use the word not to glorify it, but to vilify it. Suppose you have a character who's this racist, and you want to show this racist either for being a villainous racist or for having some sort of growth. They use the word initially and then they don't after. That's valid. That's a valid usage of the word, I think. I think comedy might be another one. I think usage among private individuals in private contexts in which everyone has shown that they're comfortable with the word, I think that could also be a valid usage. Understanding, of course, that the listener of a conversation might be more than the immediate circle of people who say it. And so as long as you're using it in an appropriate context, and I think that there can be valid usage of these words, not that they're good to, use constantly. So.
Yeah. Exactly that. So I was thinking, like, because, yeah, like he and she, in the exact same context, other people would not be so no matter how they were used, right? So that was where I was going with that. But I want to jump back to what you said previously about the society. So, what is society? Like, how big is the society we're talking about? If the community itself, doesn't care about this issue, right? If they have decided democratically that they don't care, that. And maybe, in fact, that they have a local statute that says we will not use gender affirming pronouns, right? Does that change anything? Does it have to be a larger side? Okay, if we take a poll, like you said before, 51% says yes, we are going to use the pronouns. And so, does that change anything? I mean, it's supposed to in a democracy, right? If just a slight majority want to do something like elect the leader, theoretically, but ignore the electoral college, then it's supposed to mean something. Like if you just get that slight majority, and then the rest of the society just has to go along with it. But yeah,
it's a wonderful point, and what I think it's referred to, at least in the context that I've heard it, the argument is levels of generality. What is the level of generality with respect to a lot of things? Democracy is a often one that's used. Whose democracy? Are we talking about the state, the locality, the federal, whole country, right? And I think it's the case here. We speak about institutional competency and specialization for places to know what's best for them. And that's an argument oftentimes for gun control, that states should be in charge of it because they know what's best for their own societies. But there's a fundamental baseline that oftentimes we impose. You are not allowed to, if you're a state that thinks that we should be a Christian state, you are not allowed to, even if everybody in your state wants to. And so the question is, what rules are sacrosanct with respect to speech and dealing with each other? On the one hand, I think that in the context of public employees, schools should have a lot of deference to mold their children in the ways that they want. I also see the problematic aspects of, what if we put this in the hands of people who are just very backwards, or in states where we disagree fundamentally on a lot of stuff? Am I okay with them having these kind of perverse rules about how they treat with children? I'm not okay with it. I think that we should advocate against it. Is it a constitutional violation for a state to pass a statute saying that we will not refer to people how they want to be referred to? I don't know that it's a constitutional violation. A lot of these problems, unfortunately, there's not a good answer to it. And people want there always to be a solution beyond convincing your fellow person about that you're right. People want that in the context of having hate speech laws, right? We should have laws and go after these people because they're saying horrible stuff. I think oftentimes the unsatisfying but ultimately true thing to say is, we need to convince people, and we need to work to promulgate these ideas throughout society. And don't lose hope, because we've been very successful at it. Very successful at it. Think about, it's not perfect. We're not perfect, but we have gotten so much better in the last 2 decades about speech and all these, and monitoring ourselves. For instance, how often was gay used as a pejorative in early 2000s movies? If you go back and watch a lot of those movies and TV shows, there is a lot of things that like you would cringe at listening to nowadays, how common it was. And so even though it's not satisfying for me to say, well, okay, maybe the state should be allowed to pass that law, just fight against it, COPPA, I think that we need to not ignore that problem, but we need to be okay with people thinking differently and trying to convince them.
Much agreed. Okay, well, first of all, would you mind taking questions from the audience members?
I'm totally happy to.
So if you have a question for Pisco, ping me in chat, all right? So put at PrimeCayes, and then ping me with it. I've been trying to copy the interesting things that I saw. But if you have a specific question, please ping me, and then I'll forward to Pisco. But okay, so I want to go back to that constitutionality thing that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
All right. So passing a law that says we will not call them by that. All right. Well, so one, does it make a difference if you're saying that we won't do something or that we will do something? Right. So let's say, right, is there a difference between saying we won't use gender affirming pronouns? Absolutely not. And saying we will use the T-slur against these individuals.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of, immediately when my mind races to these actions, I start to think of what could be wrong constitutionally with it. Could there be a distinction between affirmatively using a slur, putting into law that they will be referred to as such? Well, one claim I can think of is forcing individual teachers through a statute to refer to someone in a particular way. But that's kind of what this policy is advocating for. There could be some First Amendment issues like this person raised, right? That if you have a law that says you shall not refer to someone as this, or if you're a teacher, that's one thing. It might raise some First Amendment concerns, but if you have a law that says you will only refer to them as that, maybe there's some free speech concerns there that aren't present. That if you take the negative as opposed to the positive one, it's a good question. I'm not sure on any constitutional ground. It's hard for me to see how this could infringe on your free speech of the child, right? Does it infringe upon the free speech of your child to have a law that says that the child will only be referred to in such terms? Maybe it does. Maybe it does. Maybe there's equal protection concerns there, right? So the 14th Amendment says that people are entitled to the equal protection of the laws. And what's clear from our constitutional history is that laws singling out, especially like insular minorities, or minorities that have been historically disadvantaged, oftentimes they'll face additional scrutiny. And so suppose that I had a law that said, you shall refer to Black people as the N-word. That law would if you're a teacher, that law would probably be struck down as unconstitutional because it violates the Equal Protection Clause. It's not treating people differently. You're treating someone worse by referring to them as a slur on the basis of race. In the case of the trans slur, it would be on the basis of their gender identity. And so maybe you can, even though it's not a race category, it's arguably a sex category or a gender category, which has been seen as some level of intermediate scrutiny. And maybe even though it's, even if it weren't that, oftentimes the courts have been more scrutinous of laws which are targeting sort of discrete minorities. And so I could see it struck down potentially on equal protection grounds.
I know I'm going to be butchering this, but didn't Roberts famously just do a thing where
Gorsuch.
Gorsuch. Was it Gorsuch? Okay. Yeah.
That was a matter of statutory interpretation, interpreting Title VII of the
that's what it was.
Civil Rights Act. And so that would be a little bit different. But basically the argument would be, okay, you pass this law saying that teachers must refer to them as this. You're targeting someone on the basis of their gender expression, right? And so we're going to scrutinize this under equal protection grounds. And what's your reason for doing this? Well, our reason is to accommodate what we feel like is the best societal makeup in terms of family structure or religious identity. Usually that doesn't cut it when it's like something like gender or at least sex-based discrimination, where we're entrenching cultural norms about the particular sexes and genders. That's typically not been enough reason for the government to impose a restriction on those classes of people. It would be a complicated case, and I'm happy. Well, I don't know. Has there been a law like this? Maybe there has been a law and I haven't realized it. But I would be certainly against any law, and I would be happy to fight against it in court on equal protection grounds.
Yeah. And now I just had a thought. I'm not sure if you covered it because you said a lot of things when we were going over this in your head. No, it's fine. But I'm not sure if you covered this. But now that I think about it, saying that that we will not use gender-affirming pronouns is the same thing. The negative is the same as the positive, because in that case, you're going to, instead of using she when I actually use she, you're going to be using he, right? So,
yeah, we wouldn't want a municipality to escape liability just based on how you artfully phrase your law, right? So if the law has a similar effect, also if you can prove that a law has a racial purpose, sometimes you can have it struck down, even if it's not explicitly racist by its terms. So suppose you had a policy that said all people whose grand ancestors were in bondage in America as slaves shall not vote. right? That is not explicitly racist, but if it was designed, if we can get texts that show that it had a racial motive behind it, or we can have some evidence that it had a racial motive or has an obvious racial effect that's very pervasive, then it can be struck down on those grounds. And so if you had some evidence that they really wanted to discriminate against trans people, it wouldn't probably get the same treatment as racially discriminatory laws, I'm telling you, but maybe some additional review.
So, okay. And again, everyone, if you want questions answered, ping me in chat at PrimeCayes, and I'll ask Pisco. We have a few. First of all, I'm not sure if she's still here, but our good friend Joe Leslie Sirius asks, is there a difference between state schools, charter schools, and private schools in terms of free speech?
That's a wonderful question. So in terms of free speech doctrine, I'm guessing that it wouldn't apply as strictly in private schools. Probably my guess. Because you can have a school that says only Jews allowed or only Christians allowed, right? And so long as it's private, there's nothing wrong with that. That wouldn't be a violation of the First Amendment to do that. And so although I don't know for sure, my intuition is if it's a privately run organization, there's probably not a great many constitutional guidelines that hem in its treatment of the children. If it's a charter school, it's getting government money and it's being sponsored by the government, maybe there's more analysis to be done there.
This is half remembered, so take it for what you will. But there was, I believe it was the wife of our last vice president, what's his face with the dead eyes?
Mike Pence?
Mike Pence, yes, Mike Pence. I believe his wife worked at a private school, religious private school, and they had some sort of regulation about either gay. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't, but it could be the case that you have separate regulation of these schools, which forces them to be a certain way. So, like, in order to get funding from the state or to be accredited from the state, you have to comply with the following restrictions. And that could be a case where, even though the First Amendment doesn't apply, you could have these other state standards that apply to schools, regardless of whether or not they're private or whatever. So that's what that made me think of, but I don't know the particulars of the Penn situation.
Yeah, I want to say that it was like we wouldn't let in people either who were gay or was it like who affirmed themselves as trans, something along those lines. I can't remember exactly what it was, but that's what you reminded me of. I'd have to look that up again, but I remember this was a thing. So yeah, okay.
I just want to be clear in the chat. I'm not suggesting that schools don't have to follow like laws and stuff. What I'm saying is it might. I don't know the doctrine particularly, but my intuition is that schools that are totally privately owned and receive no government money at all, they're probably not any like First Amendment stuff that they need to follow. I could be wrong about that though.
Our friend Mix Vivian Wolf says, why is Pisco stifling my free speech by being afraid to debate me on the transport legislation?
What's the legislation? I wasn't aware of that issue.
Oh.
I was aware of the issue, but I didn't know that she brought it up to me.
Okay, yeah. Was there something you actually wanted to debate Pisco on? We'd love to host it. But okay. Let me. There's some other questions here too. Okay. Also, so Joe brought this up again. I'm not sure if she's still here, but she said that in Australia, all public servants don't give any political opinions because there's a clause in their contracts about being political. As I understand, the military can't give their opinions on these things, at least not in uniform. It's my.
I'm not sure about that. Okay. I remember knowing or like reading something about that, but I have no knowledge.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so we have Wick, our friend Death Certainty in chat. He says, would you be comfortable with the school using its anti-bullying rules to discipline a student for refusing to use gender pronouns? Or is it the fact that it's a teacher doing it that's important?
That's another wonderful question, because I do think that, It's a really good question.
Mm.
I think with respect to the teacher, there's a bigger rationale for schools to have teachers in line and to have teachers following a code of conduct. And for students, like I don't think there's going to be as much reputational damage to the school and for the function of the school if a particular student is acting out of line um with those values. Also, I think that the student also has First Amendment rights that we should consider. Although, again, if the student were actively seeking out a student and giving harassing, dialogue with them, or makes it, suppose the other student like doesn't want to deal with them anymore, but they keep on referring to them by the incorrect pronoun. That again, I think takes it out of the role of free speech kind of stuff and more in the harassment, bullying context. And so I would be okay with interactions between students where it's been made clear that they want to have a certain relationship or they want to be referred to in a certain manner, and that's not being abided by, and they keep interacting anyway, that would be sanctionable. But not to the extent where a student merely expressing the opinion that certain pronouns are silly or something, that they should not be expelled or anything like that. I'm worried about the function of the school, whether or not it's disrupted, and I'm worried about targeted communications to particular individuals. But I also respect the rights of these children.
But Pisco, I'm merely expressing that Black people have lower intelligence. I'm just
So if you are you allowed to have racist people in your school? I think one example that comes to mind is the Westboro Baptist Church children. They went to normal school. They were picketing against gay people on Saturday and Sunday, and they came to school on Monday. And everyone knew who they were and what they stood for. They weren't shy about their opinions that in general, whatever. And if someone asked them, I'm sure they said, yeah, and you're going to hell, and all of you are going to hell. I would feel very weird about expelling them for that. One, as a matter of public policy, I don't know that it's okay to segregate these children even more than how they are. I think a better technique would be to accept them and try to mold them. And then also, I honestly do. I think everyone deserves an education, even racists and even homophobic people. Like we should try. We shouldn't give up on them. And I would feel weird about having these bans based on opinion, so long as they're not in the harassing, disruptive kind of way.
But the line,
the role of the teacher I see a little differently.
Yeah.
The teacher, while they're also free to express their opinion outside of school and inside of school in certain contexts, but there's an interest of the school, I think, that is very strong. And no one is stopping these kids or these teachers from outside of school expressing those opinions. But these are very difficult issues. Yeah, I will say.
They're fascinating. They're really fascinating, actually, right? Because your initial reaction as a lefty like me is to be a bit retributive against these individuals and saying, no, it's not allowed. Off you go. But there's so many stakeholders, right, that you have to balance these things, right? The larger community, the school, the person who said the speech, the person who received the speech, the students themselves, right? Like, and what the messages we want the students to take away from these interactions, right? This is just amazingly fascinating stuff.
And y'all should, I know sometimes our consumption of media and social and all this stuff and these debates, you can get a little bit, what's the term? Doomer? Is that the term? Pessimistic? The culture war is being won by the left. Take heart. I think a lot of the reason why we're having these outbursts from reactionaries and cultural conservatives and social conservatives is a response to what they see as a changing world, and the world is changing. And so take that to heart. It doesn't mean to rest on your laurels, but you cannot be austere and inflexible. You need to, I think, find a way to live with people who think differently all the time, right? Pushing forward your beliefs about what society should look like, and look at where we are. Homosexuality is very accepted in America compared to where it was in years prior. And I'm sure that transgender, the transgender plight and transgender issues, they will also receive, or hopefully they will, and if we keep pushing, they will receive this kind of treatment. And I hope they do.
Yeah.
But don't get that into going too far and like totally excluding and discounting potentially redeemable people, good people. Not everyone has died from that era where everyone is homophobic. There are still people here who remember that era and who were alive during that era, and don't write them off.
I'm curious. So, Joe, she wrote something else here. She says, I'm also wondering if entire schools can object to legislative decisions about curriculum and protocol based on religious grounds. But even more just generally, I'm curious as to how much autonomy any individual school can have within a context of a district, right? So if the district is for something that us lefties want or against it, right? Would a school be able to say, no, we're going against this protocol, this rule, this regulation?
I'm not sure. You'd have to ask like
Yeah.
an education expert. My understanding is the schools have like their charter or their organizing document, and that's all a matter of, I think, state law for the most part. And so how they organize themselves and who has the right to do what probably is a matter of state law interpretation. So on that, I see someone in the chat says, "Is this guy defending transphobia?" No, I'm not. I don't think I'm defending that. I think I'm saying that we should be careful not to ostracize in an unconstructive way people who think differently, people who even racist and transphobic. We should obviously, I think, pressure people, just like we should pressure people to get vaccines, or we should pressure people to think correctly, or to think. I don't think there's anything Orwellian about that either. To have this exchange of ideas, that's the whole point of free speech, is to try to convince people, I think, and to get to truth. And so, notwithstanding the fact that we do need to convince people and fight against transphobia where we find it and racism where we find it, notwithstanding that, I think that there should be a degree of flexibility in how we deal with people, and not totally writing off as irredeemable people who have once expressed or continue to express problematic views.
Okay. Let's try to move along with these questions. I don't want to take too much of your time. And don't worry, guys. I have been copying and pasting your questions, so we're gonna get to them. But Joe just asked something I thought was also interesting. Can private colleges and universities defund student newspapers if they don't agree with political messages within them?
Easier. Yeah, it's easier to. That's a wonderful question. Because that's there. I think there is a distinction between a student publication sponsored by the school and the children's speech as such. I don't quite remember which case stands for that distinction, but I think that it's an easier thing for schools to limit publications that have the school's stamp of approval on them. Just like if the school is part of let's say a school competition off campus, maybe because the competition has the school's like stamp of approval on it, it might be easier to like limit speech of someone shouting slurs in a school sponsored game, even though it's not school property. So those are interesting issues that I think that are treated differently.
Okay. All right. So moving forward, we have a few ones. It's some good ones. Okay. So the ones from Nairasog says, does Pisco have any specific goal he wants to accomplish as a lawyer? Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna work for a firm, a wonderful firm. I'm so happy and proud to work with them, and I'll be doing litigation, working in the litigation department. I'll be doing probably rotations in general commercial litigation, white collar criminal defense, and I'm very excited for my pro bono hours, which I intend to spend on um, general criminal defense for indigent people and also immigration
Yeah.
for people who can't afford attorneys.
Mm-hmm. Someone asked, so it's North Countryman asked, thoughts on Clarence Thomas's dissent in Virginia versus Black, comparing cross burning to flag burning as content speech that can be banned.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of cases on the, is it flag burning or cross burning?
It says comparing cross burning to flag
Yeah.
burning.
Yeah, so I think there's one thing there, which is expressive conduct. There's obviously certain speech is speech. If I'm speaking right now, in some sense, it's speech. I can think of things where I could be making utterances where it would not be considered speech. But one of the difficulties is in understanding when conduct becomes speech. So, for instance, if I'm walking to get a sandwich, that's not speech, and people don't typically treat that as speech. However, if I am holding up a sandwich in front of a Subway sandwich, and breaking it to make a point about Subway's breaking of its workers, I don't know. It's a horrible example, but that could be considered expressive conduct. And so in the Black case, I don't quite remember the facts of it. I think that there was a statute that gave a presumption of guilt or something, or a presumption of something that was at issue, as well as prescribing more harshly cross burning as opposed to other conduct intended to harass somebody. I don't quite remember the facts, but yeah, I think I would agree that cross burning is expressive conduct, just as I would think that flag burning is expressive conduct, just like I would think that ripping up your draft card is expressive conduct. But the court said it wasn't when it happened.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So just. And I won't have to take too long on this, but like, I actually thought it was interesting what you brought up, right? The idea of like breaking a sandwich in front of Subway, right? Like, what if that had been something on social media, right? Like, hashtag break a sandwich, right? Because Subway is paying its work. I don't know, so I'm not making a statement. But if Subway is paying its workers half as much as they should, right? Half as much of a living wage, right? Well, then we should have half of a sandwich or something, right? Anyway, so hashtag break a sandwich, and you broke a sandwich in front of a Subway, right? Like that would be like a speech, right? Like that would be yeah.
And it should be, right? Another example is, I think one of the famous ones was someone was wearing like a jacket that just said "fuck" on it. And in the oral arguments, I remember the justice, our teacher told us, our professor told us, look up the oral arguments and see what happens. And essentially, the Supreme Court justice was like, we already know the facts of this case, so no need to rehash that. And clearly saying, like, do not say fuck in this courtroom. And the litigant, the person in oral argument says, thank you, Your Honor. This case is about a jacket that says fuck on it. Because in a sense, you're kind of giving the other side their point. If they're saying that fuck isn't covered speech and it's no one is going to say it because it's too horrible, then you not saying it in court is kind of showing that they're kind of right about that. But of course, certain conduct can be considered expressive, and I think whether it's breaking a sandwich, wearing a jacket that says fuck on it, or even burning a cross, unfortunately.
Okay. So what we got here? The process passing. Question to Pisco. I'm playing devil's advocate. This is from Rush Tenor. What would he say if a student demanded a particular pronoun or name, and the teacher was a religious Islamic woman who found it against her beliefs to do so. Would freedom of identity trump freedom of religion? How do we deal with contradicting beliefs?
Absolutely not. I think that the free expression clause of the First Amendment has been the case law there. I think is extremely contradictory at points, and I would stick with the rule in Employment Division versus Smith. I think is the case where a neutral law of general applicability doesn't raise concerns for free expression, and so this is a neutral law. It's in terms of religious expression. It's not meant to single out any religion. It generally applies to everybody, and you don't get a religious exemption from. I don't know if it's a law or a policy. It wouldn't be a law; it would be a policy. But I'm just saying law because that at issue in the Smith case was, I think, peyote use, which was a law. You don't get a religious exemption from that if it's a neutral law of general applicability. You don't get a religious exemption to murder. You don't get a religious exemption to paying your taxes. Although some religious institutions don't have to pay taxes, doesn't mean that you don't still have to pay your taxes. You can't be like, well, actually, my religious belief means that I don't ever have to pay taxes. No. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. It doesn't work when it's murder. It doesn't work when it's taxes. And on policy grounds, I think we should get rid of the religious exemptions for churches with respect to their non-exempt, their tax whatever status. And as well, I think that this ministerial exception has gone too far. I think the free exercise clause, in terms of how it's been applied in all these cases, has gone way too far.
Same here.
There's a separation of church and state, and I do not want. I think it's clearly unconstitutional for us to have "In God We Trust" on the money. I think it's clearly unconstitutional for us to have the Ten Commandments displayed in these government courts, or to have "In God We Trust" in the courtrooms. To me, it's clear as day that those are establishment cases, but I think they inform my perspective that religion should not be a big influence on government action.
Side note, and we have so many side notes here, but the Freedom from Religion Foundation, right? They've been fighting the fight against. Are you familiar with them?
Maybe I was at some point. It's not coming to my head right now, so I don't want to say no.
No, don't worry about it. But they do multiple things, but they have a judicial or a legal team, right? And they have these fights on religious grounds, and like their strategy, right? They've been saying that it's actually necessary to fight all these like tiny fights that most people would say, okay, we should let this go, right? Like, okay, yeah. Right? Like it doesn't. I can understand that having the Ten Commandments on a courtroom or in front of a courtroom is problematic, but like, why fight it? Or even better, right? The nativity scene, right? On public property, saying that like, okay, sure, this is separation of church and state, but like everyone likes it. It's like a nice thing. Like, why are atheists fighting against it? And their point was, and I love listening to their head lawyer. Their point is that like, well, if no one ever challenges it, right? Challenges these basic things, then they'll be used as justification for more egregious things in the future. That you have to fight all of these battles, including the small ones, because then, if not, then it becomes tradition. Well, it's a subtle tradition that we have these symbols here and there. Of course, separation of church and state, but there's a tradition of having these things, and no one actually fights against them. So, like, is it some larger offending religious law, right? Well, we have these traditions and that'll be our excuse to keep them around. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. And listen, there's a great deal of art that I think is religiously inspired and based on religion. Maybe there are certain displays or instances where, would I want them to be able to sue a government institution because they played religious music as part of like a playlist in one of their events or something? I don't know about that. But making religious displays like a centerpiece or a prominent area in a way that is clearly picking a favorite. If you have the Ten Commandments, you're not having other religious doctrines or other religious teachings or other types of religious laws in place, to me, I would sooner have government out of it. Leave it to the citizenry. It has no place in our government. I wouldn't like ban anyone for having a religious opinion from being in the government. That's ridiculous. Obviously, I think senators and representatives and legislators and presidents feel free to have religious opinions and religious expressions. But an act by our municipalities, our governments, those acts, I think, should be divorced from religious belief.
Back to this. So someone asked, Logos, excuse me, Logos321. I have the names like right there, but I'm like, someone asked. Whatever. And this is sort of related to the other one I had talked to you about. What if some children from conservative households are uncomfortable using other classmates' pronouns? Does that create a disruptive space in the classroom?
Yeah, that's another hard one. I think one is I think children don't have a right to be 100% comfortable everywhere they are. And children are often uncomfortable just being in school. And so I don't think that children should have an affirmative right to not be uncomfortable or whatever. But I think that it's a valid excuse for a school to invoke disruptions to the learning environment. But they don't have schools are free to pursue policies which are disruptive, right? Suppose that a school says, well, instead of having a lunch period that's segmented by class, we're just going to have everyone all together. That's probably disruptive of their school in some ways, but the school is free to pursue policies that are disruptive. They're also, I think, free to cite disruption as an excuse for getting a policy. So long as the school was the one deciding, I don't think the children have an affirmative right. I may be wrong about this. This is just my opinions about what the world should be. I don't think the students should have an affirmative right to have the optimal level of disruption. Schools are free to impose themselves on students.
Rush Tanner asked another question. For Pisco, should a kid wearing a MAGA hat be allowed to do so in school? If that kid is harassed by a fellow student or students, should those students be expelled for harassing someone for their beliefs?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question. If I had my way, I would say yes. Someone should definitely be allowed to wear a MAGA hat in school, so long as hats are generally allowed there. And I don't know why hats shouldn't be allowed. Maybe there's a good policy reason not to allow hats.
Yeah.
By the way, I think the hat policy should be uniform. If you're going to allow religious garments, I think you should allow hats. And that way, I think it's a neutral law of general applicability, and I think that it should be consistent across people, and it shouldn't be a religious exception, even in that case, in public schools, for one set of religious practitioners to be able to wear head garments just because it's important to them or important to quote unquote religious beliefs. So on that front, and that's a religious ground, I think it should be equal policy. And so I'd probably be okay with head garments. And I would think that yes, if head garments are allowed, the MAGA hat, I don't want to give a heckler's veto to people. So I don't want a heckler's veto is saying, well, you're not allowed to speak anymore because if you do, we'll start a riot. And therefore you're never allowed to speak. And so I would be okay with someone wearing a MAGA hat being allowed to wear it, so long as there wasn't some bigger issue that really was just detracting from learning. Like if it really was you could give me a case where the disruption was big enough such that, okay, no more political hats whatsoever, but in a way that discriminates against Trump, like the Trump supporter, as opposed to the whatever opposite hat. That's going to be a hard sell for me, dog. I think that, and in general, we should cultivate our children to be not freaking out by seeing someone who disagrees with them. Even if we disagree. Listen, I think Trump is a fascist. I think Trump supporters are deluded into supporting the fascist. I condemn Donald Trump in the strongest possible terms.
Yeah.
But a lot of people agree with them, and we have to learn to deal with them in responsible ways.
So, and Brush Tenor followed it up. I think this actually maybe I think you've already answered it. But what if Maghat is offensive and hurtful towards people who feel it represents anti-trans, anti-gay sentiments, right? Because
it's a good question. Suppose you had a hat that just said N-word on it or T-slur on it. There's some line drawing that has to be done here. I think that it matters whether or not the message could be particularized to an individual. So I think MAGA is a lot less particularized, although I can think of circumstances where you could conceive it as such. I think it matters to me how idiosyncratic the belief is. How idiosyncratic the reaction would be from it, or how much you should expect it to be idiosyncratic. So if someone, the reaction generally to MAGA hats is that belief, I think that should inform our conception of. I'm not just going to let anybody who reacts. Say, for instance, that I think that Yankees stand for homophobia. Maybe I'm right about that. Maybe the owner of the Yankees is some homophobic person and all of that. But I think it matters to me what the general reaction to something is. Although I also want to protect unpopular speech. And so it's a delicate balance, and it's a wonderful hypothetical. But I think that MAGA is widely promulgated enough, it's unparticularized enough that unless there was a ban on all political hats, I would be okay with the Trump hat.
As opposed to the other side, maybe a hat with a burning cross. Image of a burning cross on it. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Now, like, what's the difference between a MAGA hat and a swastika hat? I mean, I think there's a difference. Is it one that's philosophically pleasing or satisfying? No. Is it arbitrary? Certainly is. It certainly is. Yeah. But I think it's one that we all recognize as real, and that we have to draw a line somewhere.
So this brings up OnlyFacts TV brought up, and there are other questions. I know other people had previous questions. I have them written down. Shirts with beer logos were banned at my public school, public middle school and high school growing up. So in general, there's a ban on these messages, right? Messages in general, on children, right? So what like there's limits as to what you can wear, right? As we've talked about these bans, so I think you would say is that as long as it's uniform, right? So if we're banning logos, right, in this case, like beer advertisements, then should you ban any? And that doesn't make sense.
It's a level of generality thing the problem that you mentioned before, which is what does it mean to be banning logos? Are you allowed to ban political logos? What's a political logo? These are a lot of the nature of making rules is not having perfect ironclad rules, and sometimes having to make individual arbitrations or adjudications when the cases arise. So it's problematic to me this is what's a problem for me. Suppose that someone were to say, wear a hat that said, I'm a Republican, get used to it. Or were to wear like a Bush Reagan 84 or whatever. Was there an election in 84? I think there was, right? I could be wrong. Suppose someone were to wear that. I think that the Republican Party now stands for a lot of the horrible stuff that we're talking about here. But I would feel extremely uncomfortable saying that Republicans shouldn't be allowed to wear their shirts. Similarly, suppose the shoe were on the other foot and someone was wearing like a Nancy Pelosi hat or I'm a neoliberal shill shirt. And those, I think I would feel extremely uncomfortable if someone was like, no, you can't wear your Democrat shirt. That would be weird to me. And so I always try to think about if the shoe were on the other foot. Like, what if there were is there such thing as an Antifa hat? I don't know if that's a contradiction in terms. But suppose there were such a thing. Would you want them to be allowed to wear the hat? Maybe there's a line, maybe there's a level of disruption that will justify encroaching on the students' speech rights. And remember, in my mind, this is only on school time, on school property. I don't want to limit it outside of it. I don't want to limit it to when they're having Snapchats with their friends. If you're having Snapchats with your friends, that's your business, and I don't think the school should be involved unless there's a particularized incident between two students where the school needs to get involved and like separate them or do something as a matter of school policy.
Black Wolf 618. If you're still here, could you rephrase your question? Because I'm a little confused. I'm going to read it out loud as you read it, because I just copied and pasted everything. But I'm a little confused as to what you wrote down. So if you're still here, try it again. So you put down, would it not be the case that in order for the government to make use of such a, I think you meant to write quasi-suspect classification as gender, the state would have to get something significant in return, like in statutory rape. In this case, it's just this one guy. Could this help equal protection argument? I'm not exactly sure. Maybe you've made sense of that, but I'm confused.
So there's like a my professor always taught it to me as some doctrines of rational basis with teeth, equal protection cases. So imagine this, Prime. If I make a law that says blind people aren't allowed to drive cars, I'm making classifications, right? And I'm not giving equal protection to blind people. I'm not letting them get licensed, right? Mm-hmm. If I said that no black people were allowed to get driver's license, that would certainly be an equal protection problem. So in the context of equal protection, what we're worried about is the classification. Is the classification suspect? And the like de facto suspect classification is race. That's this amendment was put into place right after the Civil War. It's one of the Reconstruction amendments. And so any distinction based on race, it has to face the highest possible scrutiny in order for the law to be okay. Although sometimes it passes that, right? So can you think of an example where race-based classifications are okay, but for the government to do?
Like affirmative action.
Perfect. That's a big one on the basis of diversity. The court has said, with there's cases on it, that diversity is a compelling interest in higher education, not in high school and lower education, I think. Another one would be like I think like acting, like if they're putting on a play and we need to put on like a to be historically accurate, have Black Jesus or whatever. That was a joke. I don't know what race Jesus was. I'm remembering the Boondock scene. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Jesus was black. The government's lying about 9/11. I don't remember the full quote. Yeah. That could be maybe a compelling purpose. Now, as you go down, sex-based discrimination. One thing that when Justice Ginsburg died, you remember me coming on to talk about how impactful she was as a litigator. She helped establish sex-based classifications as a suspect classification for equal protection grounds. And so I remember invoking a case called, I think, Craig versus Boren. That's a case in which she was defending the right of men to be able to have the same amount of low alcohol beer as women, as a way of establishing sex-based classifications as something that the court's going to review. And then when she was a Supreme Court justice, she ruled in a very consequential case that sex-based discriminations are face intermediate scrutiny, not as high as race, but there's some scrutiny going on here. But for blind people, that doesn't exist, right? Every law makes classes of people, so not every class of people is going to receive. If that were the case, like you could never have any laws whatsoever. Every law is making classes of people all the time. Certain classifications, like transgender-based classifications, there's a lot of uncertainty about what that's going to look like because they haven't been tested as much as these other distinctions. And one very influential case, I think it's called Caroline Products footnote number 4 or something like that, has said that like, even if the classification isn't like a historical classification or like race or whatever, we might look a little bit harder if it's targeted at an insular minority or a historically oppressed group of people. And so what the Only Facts was saying, I think, was something about how the litigators could meet that burden if this case were to come up. but I think that the strongest ground for the law in question would be equal protection grounds.
Someone wants to know about the Redland thought wants to know about the low beer exception. So the low beer, a low percentage alcohol thing.
Oh yeah, happy to do it. So there was a law that said like women are allowed to drink this beer under a certain limit, and or something, right? They were allowed to buy, I think, certain kinds of low percentage alcohol, but men were not allowed to. So this law was discriminating against men because women were allowed to buy this beer, but men weren't. And so then lawyer Ginsburg is one of the litigants, I think, or at least she writes an amicus brief or does something to argue that this is a unjustified classification on the basis of a suspect class, which is sex, and that men should be treated the same as women in this context. And they were successful in that, I think. So that's that case, and then ultimately it went down. I think it's called Virginia versus something, VMA, Virginia Military Academy. That's the case that Ginsburg later definitively says that sex is a suspect classification.
Okay. Yeah, and sorry, Black Wolf, I didn't.
The law was trying to. Oh yeah, so the law was trying to get at. There was this notion that men are more dangerous with alcohol than women.
Okay.
Men are more likely to drink and do stupid things than women, and that's why we're going to allow women to do this.
Oh, okay. Oh, now that opens up something else. But I just wanted to say quickly to Black Wolf. Sorry, I myself, being a non-lawyer brain, did not understand your question, but I'm glad Pisco understood what you were trying to say. So I was like, these words don't make sense in this order for me. But thank you. But okay. Then what you just said. So you can't do that for that law. However, insurance companies can discriminate based on sex, right? Saying that as a young man, you are more likely to get an accident, right? And so and charge higher rates.
That I think is first off, realize that only applies to government action. Okay. So if it's a private insurance company, probably not equal protection issues. And even if there weren't, if it was government action.
But you have to buy insurance. You're required to buy insurance.
So now the government is forcing you to get into the insurance market. And so now, I don't know, but there probably is like a compelling interest for the government to do this to keep insurance markets working, right? if you could never discriminate on the basis of, although would that justify discrimination on the basis of race? Because there are certain racially linked diseases that make people more at risk. Would that be tolerable for a government to discriminate in insurance rates based on racial grounds? If we say no, why are the sex ones okay? Well, one is, as a legal matter, sex discrimination categories, those ones are given less scrutiny. It's called intermediate scrutiny, typically, I think. And so just when I say scrutiny, just get that all in your head and just be like, it's easier to make a sex discriminatory law than a racial discriminatory law in general. And so there's a less of a showing that the government needs to make. But it's a tough and thorny issue. I'm not sure how I fall there.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah. I love that these are hard. Like, I'm definitely not asking you to have the this is how it should be. But I love that these are all difficult and really interesting things to think about. Quickly going back to the head covering thing. You said like all hats should be allowed, but I imagine you would say
or not allowed.
Or not allowed, right? But if a student came in with one of those large, like, ladies, like, floppy hats.
Yeah, that's another good, you're catching me on stuff. So, what I want there to be is not a discrimination that's wrapped up in, how do I say this? I don't want mere religious exemptions to these hat policies. There can be other so suppose you had a hat that was like Carmen Sandiego. You just said it, right?
Yeah.
The size of the world, and you're literally tapping people. There, I think it's not like a content-based restriction on hat wearing. It's like a comfort / having just a workable school discrimination on those kinds of hats. Also, like, suppose you had a head covering that went over your face. there's some non-content based discrimination on what we're doing here, I guess. If you're saying no political hats, that's kind of content discrimination, like in a way, but maybe it's justified because of a disruption. And so, yes, so I think in certain contexts, political hats, even though they're content-based discriminations on hats, might be okay because of the school is going to explode unless you don't allow these hats. And then there's also the category of hats which are being banned not for content reasons, but for reasons unrelated to their content, having to do with their usefulness or their impairment in other ways of class, not based on their content. Yeah, it's a hard line to draw, though, and I'm saying a lot of arbitrary stuff.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, I just want to do something. Bad House Room says, I don't think that works, Pisco. On or not at all. You can't never have a policy that no hats equally. Yeah, right. So if I said all hats are equal, then I would have to allow a hat that, I don't know, that goes across the room, wouldn't I? Or and I'm not willing to do that.
Or those German like officer hats, like they had the spikes on them, right? Like a helmet of like maybe not.
Like a hat with a bomb on it? Yeah. No. But it's my hat. Like, no. There could be non-content based restrictions, I think, on hats or on anything. And that's what I'm most concerned about are the content based discrimination, where you're saying only religious hats are allowed or only political hats are disallowed.
Yeah.
Maybe in certain cases you can justify it. But I'm uncomfortable being like no hats, only religious hats. That to me, I don't like that.
Okay. Only facts to be one of those beer hats.
Yeah. The beer is actually in the hat.
Yeah.
It's contained in the fabric.
Okay. All right. So there are a bunch of questions who are directly related to free speech that I've been skipping, but I'll go back and do those now. So, and then there's some meme questions, so I'll put those at the end. I saw your meme questions. I'll read them out. But anyway, so okay. Does Pisco think the Constitution needs a full reform, minor reforms, or just better modern interpretations?
Major reforms in terms of election. I think that the Electoral College needs to be abolished. It needs to be a direct vote for president. I think that the number of senators needs to be adjusted in order to either greatly reduce the number of senators that small states have, or to make it all representational. I still think that there's a reason to have a Senate, even if it's more proportional. So I think that's a major reform that I'd be in favor of. I think states have enough sovereignty by themselves, and so I don't think that they should have an outsized rule of the minority in our government. I think that there needs to be more election reform in that we should enshrine some kind of ranked choice voting system in our Constitution or in our or some kind of runoff voting in our Constitution, so as to allow for other parties to be successful and then not just have stagnant two-party system. I think that we should constitutional reform make clear who has the right to count electoral votes if we're going to keep the Electoral College, because this vice president stuff, like where this is a big problem area, like a huge problem area. I think it should be made easier to make constitutional amendments, so I would amend the amendment process. What else? I'm sure there's more. There's a lot I would do, but there's some parts that are quite good.
I'd hand it over to you. Like, Pisco handle it. But someone actually,
I do want ranked choice. Sorry. Okay. I do want ranked choice.
Yeah, someone did ask Engage 3031 did ask your opinions on the process of constitutional amendments. Is it over difficult to rely on it or curb harmful localized democratic decisions? So I guess you.
So the process of amendment making, I think, it does make it difficult to pass needed constitutional reform. On the question, I think maybe there's another question embedded there. Maybe I misinterpreted, which was, don't these broad individual rights tread upon localities' abilities to tailor their legislation to whatever municipality or whatever area they are. In some ways, yes. That's why I think that, and everyone agrees with this to a certain extent. I think gun rights advocates want a very broad individual right for guns, and they want to have individual right across the country. They don't want any differences in gun. They want constitutional carry everywhere. Not all gun advocates. I'm just making a point here. And to the extent that that's the case, they want to federalize that right too. And so I think what matters is how important is the right, how fundamental is it. With regard to like the First Amendment, I think that's extremely fundamental. And so I would be happy trouncing upon individual localities and states' attempts to infringe the First Amendment, notwithstanding the fact that 90% of the whole state wants to ban Democrats from being in pools. I don't want to allow them to do that because some things are fundamental. The question is, what's fundamental, what's not?
Okay, so someone else asked a question, just copy and pasting them. All right, so there is, and everyone, getting your questions now. So if you have questions now, again, ping me in chat, so we can get them to Pisco. Right, so we're not gonna be doing this forever, so do it now. Right? Okay. So all right. So Bat Hoss Simmer had previously asked, is there any religious exception to note you would accept and why?
Yeah, I think that there's a basis for some ministerial exception to certain laws. I think that religious doctrine will often have to choose their religious leaders in the way that they want. And so perhaps I would recognize a ministerial exception for the very like top figures in a particular religious institution. Maybe I would recognize that. Maybe I would recognize religious exemptions to, maybe to certain kinds of medical treatment, but even then, probably not. Not a lot. If it's a neutral law of general applicability, very little religious exemptions that I think that are constitutional. If it's a neutral law, the government can't ban religion. The government can't tell you that like they're going to endorse a particular religion, or they're going to tell you how you're going to practice your religion as such. But if it's a genuine neutral law, I think that we should have much less tolerance for quote unquote religious exemptions.
Did you ever watch the show The Practice?
No.
Oh, it was a good show. I liked it a lot. It was a practice, and then later on, the same David E. Kelly made a different show, Boston Legal, which is more, which is lighter, a bit more comedy than drama, but still, like, talked about legal stuff. Anyway, there was the.
But I want to be clear about one thing real quick. I also respect as a principle stare decisis. And I think, notwithstanding the fact that I'm telling you guys right all now, like a bunch of my views on interpretation and where the doctrine I maybe splinter off, I think that there's a case to be made with settled law. And I'm not in the business of just overturning everything I disagree with, especially given that like there are certain factors that I think we should look to overrule cases. And I wouldn't, in order to be consistent, I would probably apply this settled law. It is settled law that blah, 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 that it's okay to do this, unless it got to the point where this law really was unworkable. We couldn't apply it. It didn't make sense anymore. Like all that stuff, unless it was, it met that threshold. I'm going to apply settled law, and I'm going to look to precedent.
I'm reminding me of those laws. Yeah, like you can't buy a pumpkin on like a Sunday. There's like interesting laws. Like if you dig into local laws, you'll find all kinds of fascinating things that I'm sure made sense at some point in time. But
yeah, I talk a big game, but like no one, if I were a judge, no one has picked me to make law, and I'm not in the business of being quote unquote activist judge and just saying, my policy preference of having a separation of church and state is now going to influence me in like trying to actively overturn Supreme Court precedent or something. If let's say I'm a lower court, So I don't think that judges should be in the role. When I'm in the role of like advocate on Twitch, that's a different role than I think the judge's role. Just to make that clear.
You and I have had an argument about activist judges before. Me saying that the Supreme Court, they're all activist judges. This is a complete
It's
bullshit.
a problematic term, okay?
Yeah.
It's a problematic term. I think there's a lot of legal work in judicial opinions, and it's not what people think, where they're just deciding every day, throwing their hands up and being, this is what the world should look like. Maybe some of them.
So going back to that, the practice, right? There was an episode which I thought was really interesting. So a member of the law firm that was the focus of the show, right? She like had some sort of accident and fell into a coma. And like they needed to give her a blood transfusion, but apparently she was a Jehovah's Witness, right? And her mother showed up. Her mother, who the law firm, the lawyers, they knew that she wasn't like that she wasn't like in contact with her mother, right? That wasn't like a solid relationship anymore. The mother says, "Well, you can't give my daughter a blood transfusion. This is one of her deeply held beliefs, right?" And so refusing that, and then her lawyer friends saying, "No, you absolutely have to give her this. She's going to die, and we don't even believe, because she never talked about her faith ever. We don't believe that she was religious." And so they went to court. The law firm lost, right? And they just had to hope she came out of the coma. She did at the end of the episode, right? And they left you hanging because they didn't actually tell you what she thought. Like at the end, like what was her.
This is something that I think a lot of courts in the past have had a problem with, which is trying to get in the weeds and be like, do you actually believe this? Or, is it actually true that Catholic doctrine tells you that you can't have male ministers or female ministers? And I think courts feel uncomfortable getting into like ecclesiastical decisions about what is and what's not a genuine religious belief or doctrine. I share some of that concern. But I think that there should be at least a superficial inquiry as a policy matter, even if not necessarily as a judicial matter. As a policy matter, I think that there should be at least a baseline inquiry into whether or not this is just a fake belief. So suppose that you said something like, yeah, our institution is against paying taxes, assuming, of course, that the tax question wasn't settled already. You like, if it was clear from all documents and all accounts that it wasn't the case, that they had this belief, then that would be a problem, I think. So while I share the concern of heavily scrutinizing ecclesiastical beliefs, I recognize that there's some worries about faking it.
Yeah, but then I think that case, or that imagined case, was really interesting in particular because of, well, it relates to that real life case with the woman who was in the coma and Congress got involved. Terry Schiavo. Yeah. So it relates to that. I don't remember the timeline, whether that was before or after this episode. This is many, many years ago. I was young when I was watching this, but it was amazing. But that it was the mother imposing that, right? So like, it's not that like you're digging through to find out this is real. The mother's actively imposing this, saying, this is my child's deeply held belief, right? Like, we come from a family that does this, right? There's no proof, again, that anyone can find. And they like throw contradicting evidence at this. They made it really ambiguous the entire time. So you'd have to decide for yourself. But like the mother is stating from the affirmative that my child would not want this life-saving treatment. And should that be allowed for medical exemption?
I don't know. It's hard. These are really hard. There's probably a basis in the Constitution, I'll say, for some religious exemptions to laws to comport with the Constitution. I just feel uncomfortable with how far they've gotten. In the case of like life-altering personal decisions, was the case that, so the mother said, didn't have custody or something, or wasn't the person in charge?
The so I don't know if she had I do not know if she had power of attorney to do this, right? Like if she was like the next of kin, because okay, so the person who was in a coma was an adult, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. But the lawyer, the legal team that had been her employer and her friends just all said that she absolutely was not religious. She never talked about it ever, right?
I see.
Yeah,
And the mother said that she was,
yeah,
right? Yeah. I think that's a question not of constitutional interpretation, but of like interpretation of whatever power of attorney or state law is at issue there. But I agree, it's a tough case. It's a tough case. The religious belief would be inquired into only insofar as that would inform her priors about what she would like to do with her life if she were ever in that state. But I think it's a little bit different than, looking at a religious institution's genuine religious beliefs in order to decide whether or not a religious exemption applies. Both tough cases, and I think a lot of great hypotheticals in the chat.
yeah.
Or real cases.
So you seem to get tired, so I want to hurry up and knock these out for you.
Sure.
Are you good? If you're
Yeah, a couple more would be good.
Okay.
I am getting tired though.
Sure. Beasticle is, man, you asked a really big question at the end here. Don't know if I already asked, but what's Pisco's opinion on parents making the abortion choice for teenage mothers? That seems like a massive question.
That's a big question. I think that it's tough for me to imagine the ultimate so long as somebody is deemed able to make a decision, it would seem tough for me to say that they wouldn't have that ultimate decision even if they were a youth. I don't think it's like all these other situations where children are not free to like decide all the time which parent they're going to be with, although oftentimes it's like a different kind of intimacy.
Oh, no. Come on, Pisco. Come on, Pisco. This one's too easy. I mean, it's too easy and how complicated it is, right? Because sure, okay, you're saying that she has the right to terminate, right, to decide to terminate, but the state would also say that she hadn't had the right to have sex in the first place, right? Like she was a minor, she couldn't consent to the sex. So now you're saying she can consent to terminating the pregnancy if she wants?
Yeah, I think that consent doesn't have to be all or nothing. There can be consent with respect to certain things. Maybe it's impossible to consent to sex, but it would be possible to consent to other things, especially with respect to a pregnancy. I would feel uncomfortable for the child not to have a say, if not a dispositive say. In other words, allowing the child to decide for themselves. This is what I'm most uncomfortable with: the government forcing you to carry a pregnancy to term against your wishes, or a government or parent forcing you to terminate a pregnancy against your wishes. That to me is not a nice road to be down. And so to the extent that we can suss out the true desires of the child, I think that should be the most relevant consideration.
Okay. All right, moving on. We have very few left, so don't worry about that.
Yeah.
Okay, so someone, this is the last lawyery question, then we have like 2 meme questions.
Sure.
So I'm surprised no one asked this for the limits of speech, but what about free speech online? Should big tech companies get to ban whoever they want?
Yeah, I think the threshold consideration there is there government interaction. I disagree with the notion that Twitter is a de facto public square. I disagree with the notion that Facebook is a de facto public square. Also, if you guys are going to pull up the quotes from whatever CEO or whatever employee, those are not dispositive on the corporation. And even if they were, they wouldn't influence my mind that as a constitutional matter, these platforms are not de facto public squares. And I don't think that the government is um, making any government action when Twitter decides to ban you. Maybe we'll come to a time where the digital space is the most salient space and the most important space. I don't think we're at that time where it's become so much of a monopoly or so much of an all-encompassing thing where it's de facto state action. And so I'm quite okay with these corporations using their First Amendment rights to not platform and not house and not channel speech that they think is not in agreement with the interests of themselves or their shareholders or society at large. That's their determination. I'm not convinced that there's like a threshold. Okay, at 300,000, all of a sudden your corporation loses the right to house whatever speech you want. And so I'm very skeptical to those arguments. I'm skeptical to the Section 230 stuff. And yeah, so I don't think it's invokes the First Amendment at all. It's not a First Amendment issue in my opinion.
Yeah. All right, so first meme question. Boji asked, ask Pisco when I get my stream. I don't know what that means, but you know Boji is B0JJY.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna respond to his Discord messages. I'm so bad about responding to Discord messages, but I will get back to you tomorrow. I'll put it on my calendar. I promise, Boji. Okay.
Okay. Boji said, theirs is not a meme question. Boji, I thought you were a woman. Okay, never mind. I don't know. I always thought you were. I don't know. Okay, maybe you know better than I do. I actually have no idea. I apologize if I've misgendered you, Boji. I believe I've addressed you as a woman previously. It's my fault. I shouldn't have done that. All right, my fault. And then Redolent's thought has been spamming me, wanting to know Peruvian or Chilean and why.
Peru. Porque soy peruano. I'm Peruvian.
Yeah. You're Peruvian. Is it about soccer? I don't know. It's
Pisco.
Yeah.
So Pisco came from Peru and is just amazing. Peruvian Pisco is the best. It's a type of liquor.
Oh, okay. Cause they literally clarified Peruvian v Chilean with Pisco as cultural and countrywide issues. Just curious if Pisco takes those into account or uses his political standing.
No, I don't really. I'm not getting into the weeds there. In fact, I don't think I've ever had Chilean Pisco, and so I can't even compare the two tastes. And usually, I'm drinking Pisco with in a mixed drink of some kind, and so even there, the quality of the drink is going to depend on a lot of other stuff besides the liquor itself. And so a lot of, I think the Pisco wars, I'm not a big fiery litigant on either side, though I will stand with Peru. Someone has to after these elections. I don't know if you guys are keeping track of the Peruvian elections, but there were two regrettable choices, I think, on offer. And it looks like a communist is going to, or at least a socialist is going to take power in Peru.
Yeah. But well, first of all, I'm not sure that one is regrettable. But the the other one was like fascist, like a daughter of a fascist.
Yeah. Oh, listen, I don't know. We have a lot of controversy about fascism recently.
Okay.
It's safe to say that Alberto Fujimori was a murderous and corrupt autocrat who, I believe, shut down Congress, suspended the Constitution, and killed a bunch of especially people in the Los Campesinos, the people outside of the city and stuff. A lot of illegal stuff. He's in jail right now, and his daughter says the first thing he's gonna do, I think, is free him or something. So yeah, not a big Fujimori fan at all. Me. But Castillo says he's gonna also suspend the Constitution or do something.
It's like nationalize resources.
Yeah, and listen, I think there's a big history of leftist populism in South America, and some of it's not too good. I think he has some sympathies, or at least some of his supporters do, with Maduro, which, you know,
Yeah.
you guys make up your conclusion about that. And so I wasn't thrilled with the choice.
Boji is female. So just so you know. Okay, that's all good. That's what I thought. I was like, I thought this was a settled thing. All right, good to know.
Sorry, Boji.
Yeah, fair enough. So,
did I say he or him?
Yeah, you said.
Did I say
he.
that?
You said he. Yeah.
Oh, well, I thought it was Boy G.
It's I don't know. B. Oh, I mean, yeah, it's B0. Yeah, B0 JJY. I'm sorry, Boji. Your name has confused me.
I thought it was Boy G. I'm assuming pronouns there, so I should be put on blast.
Yeah.
My apologies.
Yeah. All right. Oh, got it. All right. But I think that's it. We'll continue on. The stream's not ending. We're going to continue on for our open walk on panel right afterwards. Well, honest members like you, yes, you staying at home, you may take a part, and we can talk about the things we've discussed here. If you guys want to expand on that, we'd love to do that. This has been fascinating. Like, that's why we haven't done this in a while. We've done this before where we just, like, you know, one-on-one talked about one of these constitutional issues, right? Or hashed out some sort of legal problem, right? Or you hashed it out and I just, like, toss questions at you. But this is always so much fun talking to you. I know we're gonna have less and less time, you know, like, as you're studying, and then after you will definitely pass the bar, right? But, like, I love doing this with you. This is so fun.
It's a pleasure always to be on your panels, Prime. I think it's been over, 13 months now since I subbed and started coming on, and my God, how the world has moved. This has been totally, I think, a fascinating experience to be a part of. If anything, if I never stream again, if I come on less frequently, I think it's given me less anxiety about hearing my own voice, about speaking in front of people. And so for that, I thank you so much, and for everyone for listening.
And if you ever do come back to streaming, will you ever realize that it may not be the best idea to sit like this?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was, like, slouching now, but yeah, I'm sorry.
You do it all the time.
I know. The problem is, like, I've been, like, talking now since 8 o'clock. Although I'm not gonna lie, I was slouching in that too. I gotta work on it. I've built a lot of bad habits during COVID because I've just been, like, in my office, leaning back, typing away and stuff. And so I will do my best either to adjust my camera or to sit up more.
All right. Well, thank you so much, my man. Get some rest and pass that bar exam. We're gonna have such a celebration when it happens. We're gonna have such a celebration. It's gonna be a big thing.
How about when COVID ends, we'll have a PrimeCayes meetup, New York City. We'll pick, like, a bar or something.
Okay.
And y'all can come and say hi.
Oh.
This will be in a year.
Yes, this will be in a year. Okay. All right. Meetup.
If you're here, you're invited. If you're not, you're not.
You're not. It's how it is. How it is. All right. That sounds like a lot of fun. All right. Well, we'll talk to you, friend. Have a good one.
Much love. Have a good one.